Hello again. Today we want to talk about the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And you might say, well, I wasn't even there. How do I know Jesus was raised from the dead? That's a good question. Are we just supposed to cross our fingers and kind of hope he was raised from the dead? Are we just supposed to guess he was raised from the dead, or just kind of wait for a feeling to confirm whether he was or wasn't raised from the dead? Or is it just kind of a topic that we can dismiss and forget about? In the book of Hebrews chapter 11 and in verse 1 it says, "Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen." You might say, well, how can I believe in something I can't see? Well, you do it all the time. You've been doing it for most of your life. There's a lot of things that you can't see. You can't see the law of gravity. You can't actually see a law out there, but you can see the effects of it. You were there at your birth, but you don't remember being born, and so how do you know that your mom is really your mom? You go to a doctor and you see things on his wall, but how do you know that that doctor really is a doctor? You did not see him graduate. You did not see him get his degree. You did not see him be an intern. You did not see him go to college. You didn't see any of that, but you believe he's a doctor. And you would say, well, the reason I believe in all those things is because evidence. There's a lot of evidence that even though I didn't see it, and there's a lot of places in the world that you've never been to, never seen, but you believe they're there. And so you believe in things all the time that you can't see or that you've never seen based on evidence. And that's the same thing as far as what God is trying to get across to us, so that faith is not just a wish. Faith is just not some sort of pipe dream or hope. And faith is not just a good guess, but faith is rather the conviction of something you can't see. And the reason you're convicted of it is because you have all this evidence that tells you, even though I was not there at the time, and even though I have not seen that, I know that happened, or I know that place really exists because all of this evidence. I mean, anytime that you're on a jury, basically you're being asked to convict somebody on the basis of faith. That is, on the basis of evidence being presented. You were not there. You did not witness the crime. Maybe nobody else did either. But all this evidence is brought forward, and you either say the guy's innocent or the person is guilty. And that's on the basis of faith. Faith based on evidence. Not a wish, not just kind of a guess, but a conviction based on evidence. That is, you did not see that, but the evidence adds up to that really did happen. And that's the same thing not only with the existence of God, but also whether Jesus was raised from the dead. In the book of Acts chapter 1, it's interesting the way that Luke words the beginning of Acts. It says in Acts chapter 1 and in verse 3, it says, "To these he also presented himself alive after his suffering by many convincing proofs, appearing to them over a period of 40 days. That's interesting that Luke says that Jesus appeared to the apostles and gave many convincing proofs that he was actually alive and that it was really him and that was his body that they were seeing before them. In Acts chapter 17, we have a very similar statement that Paul makes. It says in verse 2, according to Paul's custom, he went to them and for 3 Sabbaths reasoned with them from the Scriptures. He would go into a Jewish synagogue where people already believed in the one true God, and they already believed in the Old Testament, and so he would go in there. And then what he would do is that he would take the Scriptures that they had, and then out of those Scriptures he would point out the Scriptures that predicted Jesus' life, death, burial, and his resurrection. Verse 3, it says, explaining and giving evidence that Christ had to suffer and rise again from the dead. Giving evidence, that's an interesting statement, that Paul was not appealing to emotion. Paul was not just saying, we just got to believe this, you just got to feel this. Paul rather was taking evidence, he was taking Scriptures from the Old Testament, and he was pointing out to them that how in those Scriptures clearly predicted Jesus' life, Jesus' death, crucifixion, Jesus' burial, and Jesus' resurrection. And notice how Luke explains it. He says he was explaining, he was laying it out, and he was giving evidence. He was offering proof of the resurrection from their very Scriptures. That's interesting. And so Paul does not go in and simply argue, you just got to believe this, or you just got to feel to this. Rather, he goes in and says, here's the evidence. I'm going to lay it out for you. Here's all the evidence. You make the decision, but there's the evidence. There's the mountain of evidence to convict you. Now, either you accept that or you reject that. But there's the mountain of evidence right before you. And so faith is not this. Faith is not a guess. Faith is a conviction based on evidence. Plain and clear evidence. Well, let's walk a little farther here. It's interesting that the disciples did not make up the story of the resurrection. That's not something that they made up or decided, you know what, we just think that it would be good to say that Jesus rose from the dead, or that's just kind of one of those things that we think happened, etc. That's not really the way it happened. In the book of Matthew chapter 16, it is Jesus is the one who said clearly that he was going to be put to death by the hands of the Jewish rulers, and that he was going to be raised. In the book of Matthew chapter 16, verse 21, he says, from that time Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed and be raised up on, and notice this, not just be raised up, but he said be raised up on the third day. He was very specific. That is, he said, you put me to death, and 3 days later I will rise. And that is something unheard of as far as, I mean, either it's going to happen or not going to happen. There's no wiggle room on I'll be killed and raised on the third day. There's no other way that you can really explain that other than he's going to be killed and raised on the third day. It's not metaphorical. It's not allegorical. Jesus really at that point put himself into a corner. And from now on, anyone who looks at Jesus, that would be something you could look at. Either that happened, which means he would be the Son of God and the Savior of the world and the only way to the Father, or it did not happen, which means he was a fraud. I mean, it's one or the other. There's really no other choice there about Jesus when you look at that statement. Either he did die and was raised on the third day, or it did not happen. Now, if you were a fraud, you would never have said something like that because you've left yourself no room of escape. You've left yourself no way to kind of back out of that. Someone who's a cheat or a liar or a fraud would never make a statement like that. Or a liar would never make a statement like that. There's no wiggle room. There's no way to get out of that. You've boxed yourself into that. Many politicians wouldn't say something like that either because it gives them no way out. You either do it or you don't do it. It either happens and you manifest yourself to the entire world that you are the Son of God, or it doesn't happen and then you manifest yourself to the entire world that you're a fraud. But there's no room there. And so it wasn't that Jesus died and decades or centuries later that a group of his followers came up with this idea of a resurrection. Jesus said, you put me to death and I'll be raised on the third day. Before it even happened. And so he had clearly predicted that. And it's not only there that he does it, it's not just in some sort of obscure passage, but he does it a number of times. He will say that. He will say in Matthew chapter 20 in verse 18 and 19, behold, we're going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered to the chief priests and scribes, and they will condemn him to death, and will deliver him to the Gentiles to mock and scourge and crucify him. And on the third day, he'll be raised up. Now, that's very clear too. That is, it's not that the Jews are going to crucify him. He'll be handled to the Gentiles, to the Romans. Somebody else will be doing the crucifying. Someone else will do the dirty deed. And then, and not only that, but it also specifically informs them how he will die. It's not that he will be stoned. That was the Jewish method of the death penalty. He won't be stoned. He'll be crucified. And on the third day, again, very specific, on the third day, he'll be raised up. The same thought is found in John chapter 2 and in verse 21, third day. And so there are at least three passages here that we have a specific, put me to death by crucifixion, and on the third day, I will rise. All right. Well, let's walk a little farther here. Let's talk about what we know about Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. Years ago in a book called Therefore Stand, Wilbur M. Smith wrote something, and he said, let it be simply said that we know more about the details of the hours immediately before and the actual death of Jesus in or near Jerusalem than we know about the death of any other one man in all the ancient world. In fact, we know more about what happened and what was said during the last week of his life on earth than we know about any other entire year of his life. We know what he said to his disciples throughout Thursday of that week and the institution of the Lord's Supper that night, the agony of suffering in the garden, the nature of the crowd that came out to arrest him in the garden. We know how he was betrayed by a kiss from Judas. We know of the 5 trials that he underwent within the last 8 hours, 2 before the Jewish authorities, 2 before Pilate, and 1 before Herod. We know what men said to him and what they said against him and what he said to them. We know how the soldiers despitefully used him. We know how the Sanhedrin bribed witnesses to condemn him. We know even the name of an obscure person who carried part of his cross to Golgotha. We know of the 2 men who were crucified on either side of him. We know the words that came from his lips while he hung upon the cross. We know the insults that were hurled at him while he was upon the cross. We know what the soldiers did at the foot of the cross. We know what the women felt. We know what the repentant thief said to him. We know how darkness enveloped him. We know how the veil of the temple was rent, specifically how it was torn. We know of an earthquake that shook the city. And then he said, nothing here is mythical, and nothing here is even theological. It's simply history. Just historical fact. So we're given all these details about his arrest and his trials and how Pilate tried to release him and what Pilate said to him in the conversations they had. And we know all of that and all the details surrounding his crucifixion and all the details about where he was buried and where the tomb was. We're given a tremendous amount of historical information, and so nothing there is mythical. It's just history. Now, what you make of it, that is theological, what you make of it. But all these details here are simply history. All right. Now, for a long time, there have been attempts to get around the resurrection and to come up with alternative theories of what happened to the body. And let's stop right here and point out that everybody, believer, unbeliever, Christian, Jew, whatever, everyone admits that on the 3rd day, that tomb was empty. You see, we have all these alternative theories that men have come up with, but all of the theories are attempting to explain one detail. That is, what happened to the body. None of the theories have the body still in the tomb. All of these alternative theories admit that on the 3rd day, the body was gone. They all admit that. They're just attempts to try to explain the removal of the body without a resurrection. But they all do admit one fact. That is, on the 3rd day, the body of Jesus was no longer in the tomb. And so one's called the telegram theory, and that is that Jesus ascended in the spirit, not in the body, and that from heaven he kind of telegraphed pictures of himself or of his body to his disciples. That is, he kind of telegraphed an image back to earth to the disciples that kind of gave them the mistaken impression that he had been raised from the dead. Well, there's a couple problems with that. Well, one problem is that that's not really that much of a big deal. That is, everybody ascends at death in the Spirit. Ecclesiastes chapter 12, that's really no accomplishment to ascend in the Spirit. Everyone does that. You die and your spirit returns to God who gave it. That happens to everybody. Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verse 7, the dust will return to the earth as it was, and the spirit will return to God who gave it. So everyone ascends in the Spirit. But not only that, but it is clear that the disciples are not just seeing a vision or some sort of television picture or whatever, or a telegraphed image. In the book of Luke chapter 24, and again, we're just reading the historical details, that's all we are. It says, "And while they were telling these things, he himself stood in their midst." Now, notice the text, he himself stood in their midst, not a vision of him, not an image of him, but actually he stood there. They were startled and frightened and thought that they were seeing a spirit or a ghost or some sort of apparition. He said to them, "Why are you troubled, and why do doubts arise in your hearts? See my hands and my feet, that it is I myself. Touch me and see, for a spirit does not have flesh and bones, as you see that I have." And obviously this is not some sort of image. This is not some sort of vision. That Jesus is doing everything he can to correct the mistaken idea that they are only seeing some sort of faint image or ghostly image or vision of him. No, it is I myself. It's me. Here's my hands. Look at my feet. And then he picked up a piece of fish and ate it in their presence. Now, some sort of telegraphed image or vision is not going to be picking up food and eating it, and that's what Jesus did. He ate and drank with them. And so we can kind of toss that one out there. Not only that, but that's unworthy of Jesus. That's unworthy of God to try to deceive people that what's me, but it's not really me. No, if Jesus said that it's me, then it's him. And this is my body, and then that was his body, and he was really there. Another theory is the hallucination theory. This theory is the idea that the disciples were so distraught with grief after Jesus' death and so much in a state of shock, and they wanted to see him so badly that they simply imagined that they had seen him. Well, the problem with that is in Luke again. Jesus actually shows up. And in fact, they were really surprised that he showed up. That is, they were not trying to imagine to see him. They were not trying to put themselves into some sort of trance and see Jesus. They were completely caught off guard by the resurrection. Yeah, Jesus had talked to them about the resurrection, but the problem is that they had been very slow to believe such teaching. They had just not accepted that was going to happen. In the book of Mark chapter 16, it says in verse 14, "And afterward he appeared to the 11, that is the apostles, of course minus Judas, as they were reclining at table, and he reproached them," he rebuked them, "for their unbelief and hardness of heart, because they had not believed those who had seen him after he was arisen." So the idea that the apostles were hallucinating is completely contrary to the text. In fact, the opposite's true. First of all, a number of people had showed up to the apostles, like the women, Mary Magdalene, etc., and showed up and said, "We have seen Jesus." You know what the apostles did? Well, no, he didn't. They did not believe that. And so the apostles are not in any state of mind to be hallucinating because they are not planning on seeing Jesus. They did not believe the people who saw Jesus, some of the first people who saw him that came and said, "We've seen Jesus." They didn't believe him. And of course, when Jesus actually does show up, he rebukes them and says, "What gives? What's up?" And people come up, and these people say they've seen me, and you guys, "Oh, no, you haven't." He rebukes them for their hardness of heart. So the apostles are not in any sort of condition to be hallucinating. All right, and so Jesus corrects them here. Jesus corrects them and says, "Why are you troubled?" They thought they were seeing a vision. He says, "No, it's me. I myself, touch me and see me." He challenged them, "Touch me and see me." Now, he would issue the same challenge to Thomas a week later. Because Thomas had not been present, he had issued them the same challenge of put your fingers in the prints where the nails are in my hands. And be not unbelieving, but be believing. And so we kind of have to toss out the hallucination theory. Now there's one other major problem with the hallucination theory. That is, and sometimes you just kind of have to say, okay, let's take this argument and let's kind of assume that the argument's true. Let's say that that it just was a hallucination. Okay, where would the body be? Well, the body would still be in the tomb. Well, but the body wasn't in the tomb. And so that's another problem with this idea that it was simply a hallucination or that it was a telegram from heaven, is that the body would have been still in the tomb. But the body's not in the tomb. And everybody admits that the body wasn't in the tomb. And we will get down to that a little bit farther here, as far as even the enemies of Jesus admitted the body was not in the tomb. And so hallucinations and telegraphs and visions do not move bodies out of tombs. When you deal with the resurrection, you have to deal with this one historical fact. On the third day the body was gone. You have to come to terms with that. What happened to it? And so if you're an unbeliever, you have to come up with a credible alternative explanation. And we've looked at two alternative explanations, the telegram theory and the hallucination theory, and found them very poor theories and really wanting. Well, how about another one? How about the swoon theory? This is the theory that Jesus did not really die upon the cross, that he actually passed out upon the cross because of all the pain. And at some point in the tomb he revived, and he was able to move the stone and get past the guard and walk about 7 miles and appear to the disciples, and more than once, and appear to them and convince them that he had conquered death. And then about 40 days later or so that he finally died, and the place of his death is unknown. That's the swoon theory. And I think as you're looking at that, you're going like, wow, it takes more faith to believe in that than to believe what really happened. And a lot of times that's true. A lot of times that's true with man's theories, is it takes far more faith to believe some theory that man has than really what the Bible said all along. And that would be true of this particular theory as well. Well, there's just a number of problems with that. The first one, of course, is it just denies the historical evidence that we have. That is, it denies the testimony of the people that were actually there at the time. And I think that has far more credibility than some theory somebody comes along with thousands of years later, is what did the people at the time say? What's the evidence say in the historical documents? We want to be good historians, and we want to base our faith on facts and not human opinion. And so what did the people say at the time who were actually there? John chapter 19 and verse 32, it says, "The soldiers therefore came, broke the legs of the first man and of the second man who was crucified with him. But coming to Jesus when they saw that he was already dead," so there's the historical testimony, "they did not break his legs, but one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and immediately there came out blood and water." That is just in case that, here were Roman soldiers, and they were accustomed to death. And so they knew what a dead man looked like. But I like what that one soldier did, is that just in case that maybe they were not accurate this time about Jesus being dead, they took a Roman spear and simply thrust it into his side. And so here we have clear evidence at the scene of the cross. The soldier said he's dead. Secondly, just in case, or to make sure, doubly sure, they thrust a spear into his side, and out came a large quantity of both blood and water. Well, obviously he's dead. And not only that, but then we have the testimony of the people that took him down from the cross and handled his body. So we have in verse 38, we have Joseph of Arimathea, and he came to Pilate, asked for the body. And it's interesting in Mark's account, when Joseph shows up and asks for the body, Pilate was surprised that Jesus had died or was dead already. And so it's interesting over in the book of Mark chapter 15, more historical testimony, verse 44, Pilate wondered if he was dead by this time, and summoning the centurion, he questioned him as whether he was already dead. And ascertaining this from the centurion, he granted the body to Joseph. That is, Pilate did not let that body go until there was confirmation that Jesus was dead. And so when he got the confirmation, the centurion says, yeah, he's dead. The body at that point was released to Joseph. Then it says in verse 39 of John 19, Nicodemus came also, who had first come to him by night, bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 100 pounds weight. And so they took the body of Jesus, bound it in a linen wrappings and spices, as is the burial custom of the Jews. Now the place where he was crucified was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb which no one yet had been laid. Therefore, on account of the Jewish day of preparation, because the tomb was nearby, they laid Jesus there. There's the historical testimony of the people that were there at the time. That is, the soldier said he's dead. And then we have the spear thrust in his side. And then Joseph of Arimathea shows up and says, I want the body. Pilate says, is he dead yet? And then Centurion, is he dead yet? Centurion says, yes, he's dead. The body is granted. Now, then the body's all covered in all these spices from head to toe. And the body is then tightly bound and placed in a tomb. And right there, the whole swoon theory completely falls apart. Because are you telling me that everybody's wrong on the fact that he was dead, and then all this very aromatic spices are put all over his face, his entire body, and then he's wrapped, and so, I mean, that either is going to wake you up like smelling salts, or that's going to suffocate you, one or the other. And then somehow in the tomb that you're going to be able to free yourself from that and actually roll away a stone that two women could not move, and fight your way past a Roman guard, and then walk 7 miles and still be alive for 40 days, and then finally die. That doesn't make any sense. In fact, it takes far more faith to believe in that than it does in what really happened. In fact, the type of faith that would believe in a hallucination theory or a swoon theory is blind faith. But what would believe in the resurrection is that we're just looking at the historical document. We're just looking at the evidence and the facts. And we're just weighing them. That's all we're doing with a good and honest heart and saying, okay, what does the evidence say? I have no dog in this fight. I just want to know, what's the evidence say? Did Jesus raise or was he not raised? I have no preconceived idea. I have no loyalty one way or another. I just want to know what the facts are. And as we're looking at the facts clearly point out that the tomb was empty on the third day, and that Jesus had predicted that, and that we have eyewitnesses that he was dead when he was placed in the tomb, and everyone knew where the tomb was. And so it's not some sort of secret, mysterious place. Now, the next theory we come to is the theory that the women went to the wrong tomb, is that they were so blinded by their tears on that early first day of the week that they simply showed up at the wrong tomb. Well, there's a number of problems with that. Of course, the biggest problem is that if the women had went to the wrong tomb, the body would still be in the right tomb. And on the day of Pentecost, when the apostles started preaching that Jesus was raised, all the Jewish or Roman authorities had to do is simply go to the right tomb, produce the body, but no one ever produced the body. And so women going to the wrong tomb do not move bodies. Women going to the wrong tomb does not remove the body from the right tomb. And not only that, we got to give the women more credit than that. That's idea the women went to the wrong tomb. Well, you weren't there. Let's read about the people that were actually there. Let's just read the documentation. Let's read the historical evidence. Luke chapter 24, verse 55, Luke chapter 23, verse 55. And it was on the preparation day, and the Sabbath was about to begin. Now the women who had come with him out of Galilee followed after and saw the tomb and how his body was laid. That is, on the evening of the burial, the women had actually went with the burial party, with Joseph and Nicodemus, and they had a hand in wrapping the body. And they actually saw where the tomb was, where this tomb was located. They actually saw how the body was positioned in the tomb. It says, and they returned and prepared spices and perfumes. That is, they came back to do more of the burial process. But they would have to rest on the Sabbath in between. But they clearly saw where the tomb was. It says in Luke chapter 24, verse 1, but on the first day of the week at early dawn, they came to the tomb. They didn't go to the wrong tomb. They came to the tomb, bring the spices which they had prepared, and they found the stone rolled from the tomb. But when they entered, they did not find the body of Jesus. Now that's interesting. The women actually go into the tomb. and look around. And so will a couple of individuals in John 20. And so it's not that they just kind of showed up and, there's a tomb, looks familiar, and it's not sealed. He'd been raised. No, there's the tomb, stones rolled away, and they go inside and looked around. They checked it out. He's not there. In verse 4, and it happened that while they were perplexed about this, behold, two men suddenly stood near them in dazzling apparel. And as the women were terrified and bowed their faces to the ground, the men said, why do you seek the living one among the dead? He is not here, but he is risen. Now, right there, the angels confirm you're at the right tomb. You are not at the wrong tomb, you're at the right tomb. He is not here. Are you seeking the living among the dead? Were the angels also at the wrong tomb? That doesn't make any sense. And so clearly the tomb here is a well-known tomb. It was a tomb that was nearby and the place of crucifixion. John tells us that, John chapter 19. Now, the place where he was crucified, there was a garden, so we got these specific details. And in the garden was a new tomb. Also, there is no confusion about any sort of previous bodies in the tomb, like, is that his body or is that somebody else's body? This is a tomb that no man had ever been placed in before. This is a brand new tomb. So there can't be any confusion about, was that his body or is that somebody else's body? Or how many bodies were in there? Were there 3 bodies in there or 4 bodies in there? Things like that. All right. Let's go to a passage here in the book of Matthew chapter 27. Because this section here answers also a number of other questions. Again, we're just looking at the historical evidence. That's what we're looking at, and just being having honest and good hearts, looking at the evidence and making a decision. Now, in Matthew chapter 27, verse 57, and when it was evening, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who himself had become a disciple of Jesus. The man went to Pilate, asked for the body of Jesus, and Pilate ordered it to be given over to him. Joseph took the body, wrapped it in a clean linen cloth, laid it in his own new tomb, which he had hewn out of the rock, and he rolled a large stone against the entrance of the tomb and went away. Typically there'd be a large stone and there'd be a groove that stone would fit in, and then you would just kind of roll that in front of the opening. Notice it's cut out of solid rock and there's no back door. Mary Magdalene was there, and the other Mary sitting opposite the grave. They right there, they clearly saw where he was placed. And that's one of those things you never forget. Like if your mom or dad dies and they're buried somewhere, you may not go back to that graveyard. Maybe you don't even live there. Maybe you live somewhere else. And then you come back years later and visit. There's no questions about in your mind where they're buried. It's very vivid in your mind of, I know exactly what part of that cemetery I need to go to. Maybe 10, 20 years before you go back, and you can actually go back and to the spot. Things like that you don't forget. But let's go a little farther. Now on the next day, which is the day after the preparation, the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered together with Pilate. And sir, we remember that when he was still alive, that deceiver said, after 3 days I will rise again. That's interesting. The information that Jesus had taught about his resurrection was very public. Even his enemies knew that he had claimed to rise again from the dead, and even his enemies knew the precise time, 3rd day. All right. Therefore, give orders for the grave to be made secure until the 3rd day, lest the disciples come and steal him away and say to the people, he has risen from the dead, and the last deception be worse than the first. Pilate said to them, you have a guard, go make it as secure as you know how. They went, made the grave secure, and along with the guard, they set a seal on the stone. All right. Thank you to the Jewish rulers who did that. Because right there, there's a number of theories that we cannot accept. We cannot accept that Joseph of Arimathea took the body. He could not have. The tomb was guarded. We cannot accept the theory that someone else, some unknown person, took the body. Right here, Matthew tells us, the historical evidence tells us, that The body was in the tomb when the tomb was sealed and guarded. I mean, obviously the soldiers are not going to come up, show up and guard an empty tomb. Obviously they're going to double check everything. You know, is there a body in there or not? They're going to double check everything. And then they will set their guard and they will seal that. And so right there, no way can anybody get in or out of that tomb. The disciples can't do it. Mary Magdalene can't do it. Mary can't do it. Joseph of Arimathea, Nicodemus, or some unknown person that we're not told about. There's just no way. And so right there, thank you to the Jewish authorities, because what that does is that authenticates everything. That tells us that there was a body in that tomb prior to the third day. And the tomb was guarded and the tomb was sealed. That tells us all of that. And so we have a guard on it. We have it sealed. And so there's no way that body is going to get out of that tomb. The only way that that body could get out of that tomb is by miracle, by resurrection. That's the only way it could happen. And so we need to be grateful for the decision by those men to do that. And that's right there in the historical evidence, in the documentation. All right. Some have said that the Jewish authorities took the body, but right here it tells you, no, that they did not want that body leaving that tomb because they feared what would happen if the body did leave the tomb. That this movement now would really grow if that body leaves the tomb. And so it was in their religious and political interest to keep that body in the tomb, and they did everything they could to do that. Of course, the Romans are not going to take the body out of the tomb because the Romans are going to respect that seal. And even if the Romans or the Jewish leaders had taken the body out of the tomb, once the apostles start preaching the resurrection, and that is becoming such a headache for the Jewish leadership because they're losing priests, Acts chapter 6, verse 7. They're losing followers. And the Romans, now this is a movement that is catching fire in every city in the Roman Empire. And the Romans and the Jewish leaders never produced a body. It would have been very easy to stop Christianity in its tracks if the Jewish rulers or the Roman authorities had just shown up with the body and said, "Bada! There it is." Christianity would have died on the vine. That never happened. And they had all sorts of opportunities to do that. Acts chapter 4, Acts chapter 5, the apostles are brought. In Acts chapter 5, Acts 4, Peter and John. They're brought before the authorities. They said, "We don't want you teaching anymore this idea of Jesus was raised. You have filled Jerusalem with the teaching." It was causing them major headaches. And yet we never have an argument against the resurrection, and we never have any evidence presented against the resurrection. What's that tell you? Tells you they didn't have an argument. Tells you they did not have any evidence against the resurrection. Well, Matthew chapter 28. In verse 11, Jesus is raised, the tomb is empty. But while they were on their way, behold, some of the guard came into the city and reported to the chief priests all that had happened. And when they had assembled with the elders and council together, they gave a large sum of money to the soldiers and said, "You are to say, his disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep. And if it should come to the governor's ears, we will win him over and keep you out of trouble." They took the money and did as they had been instructed. And this story was widely spread among the Jews and is to this day. The idea that the disciples took the body was the first theory that was presented to explain away the removal of the body, how the body disappeared. It was a bribe. The soldiers were given money. They came. Remember, the soldiers are not the one who came up with the idea. The soldiers simply came to the Jewish leaders and said, the body's gone. The body's gone. And the Jewish rulers could not say, well, an angel came down and opened up the tomb and the soldiers fainted and things like that. They can't say that. What they said was, well, say the disciples came and took the body while we were sleeping. But that would not even be allowed in the court of law. How? If If you went into court and you were suing your neighbor, and you said, and the judge said, why are you suing your neighbor? And you say, well, the neighbor took my television. And the judge says, well, when? And you said, well, he took it while I was asleep. The judge would say, how do you know what was going on when you were asleep? And they would throw that case out of court. That's the same thing with this. The disciples took the body while we were sleeping. Well, if you're sleeping, you don't have a clue what's going on when you're sleeping. How do you know it was them or anybody else or whatever? And so that's a ridiculous excuse, isn't it? Yeah, but that's the best they can come up with. If that's the best argument they can come up with, it tells you something. It tells you they didn't have an argument. And so that leaves us with the only other conclusion. He was raised from the dead. And that is not this. That's not we're just crossing our fingers and hope that. He was raised from the dead based on the historical evidence. That's the only conclusion faith can come to. That is intelligent faith, a good, honest heart faith. That's the only conclusion you can come to. You look at the historical evidence and you just read what the passage say, and you look at the alternatives and you dissect them, and the only conclusion you can come to is Jesus was raised from the dead. On the third day, the tomb was empty, the body was gone because he had been raised from the dead by the power of God. That's the only conclusion you can come to. Now, finally, as we close here, I want to deal with something is that if you try to explain away the resurrection, you're not helping yourself. Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, 1 Corinthians 15, 17, if Christ has not been raised, Paul does not say you're off the hook, you're not accountable to God. No. If Christ has not been raised, your faith is worthless, you are still in your sins. If Jesus was not raised from the dead, you're not off the hook. It doesn't mean that you're not accountable to God. It doesn't mean, well, I don't have to do any of this. And no, what it means is you're lost and there's no Savior. That's what it means. If Jesus was not raised from the dead, you're still in sin. It's now you're just in sin with no hope. And so what would you prefer? No hope, or Jesus was raised from the dead and you have the hope of eternal life if you believe Him, and it's very easy to believe in Him. Evidence, just look at the evidence. And we'll have another lesson on that. Turn from your sins. You already know you shouldn't be lying and drinking and doing drugs and sleeping around. You already know you shouldn't be doing that, so that's a no-brainer that you need to repent. You need to change your life. Confess Christ and be baptized in immersed in water for the forgiveness of your sins. And then remain faithful to God. Hey, if you got any questions, give us a call, 503-644-9017. See us on the web, beavertonchurchofchrist.net. Until next time, thanks for spending some time with us. We'll see you later. Thank you.